It was just another busy Wednesday morning in early October when Mrs. Parker rushed through her morning routine. She hadn't planned on visiting her son's school that day. Her schedule was already packed with job interviews and errands. But as she was making her morning coffee, she spotted something that made her heart sink. Her son's science project sitting on the kitchen counter. The one that was due today. "Baby, you forgot your project," she called out, but the school bus had already pulled away 5 minutes ago. She sighed, looking at the carefully constructed model of the solar system that her son had spent the whole weekend working on. The planets were made from painted styrofoam balls, and you could tell how proud he was of the glitter-covered rings around Saturn. There was no way she could let all that hard work go to waste. After quickly changing from her pajamas into something more presentable, Mrs. Parker carefully picked up the project and headed to her car. The morning traffic was surprisingly light, and she found herself humming along to an old soul song on the radio. Maybe this unexpected detour wasn't so bad after all. She could surprise her son during lunch hour and see how he was doing at school. The familiar sight of Roosevelt Elementary brought back memories of her own school days. The brick building hadn't changed much over the years, and the colorful autumn leaves scattered across the playground made it look like something out of a painting. As she walked through the front doors, the smell of cafeteria food and school supplies filled the air. The front office was busy with typical morning activity. A couple of late students getting their passes, a parent dropping off medication, and the school secretary juggling phone calls. Mrs. Parker couldn't help but smile at the organized chaos of it all. The secretary, a kind-faced woman with reading glasses perched on her nose, looked up from her computer. "Can I help you?" she asked warmly. "Yes, I'm here to drop off my son's science project. He left it at home this morning," Mrs. Parker explained, carefully holding up the solar system model. "Oh my, that's quite impressive," the secretary exclaimed, genuinely admiring the detailed work. "You know what? It's almost lunchtime. Why don't you take it to him yourself? I'm sure he'd love to see you." Mrs. Parker checked her watch. 11:45 a.m. Perfect timing. After signing in and getting a visitor's badge, she made her way through the familiar hallways. The walls were covered with student artwork and motivational posters, and she could hear the muffled sounds of learning coming from behind closed classroom doors. As she approached the cafeteria, the sounds of childhood laughter and excited chatter grew louder. She remembered her son mentioning that third grade had the first lunch period. The large double doors were propped open, and the aroma of today's lunch special, something that smelled like pizza, wafted into the hallway. What happened next would change everything, though Mrs. Parker didn't know it yet. Standing in the doorway, holding her son's science project, she was about to witness something that would touch her heart in ways she never expected. Something that would remind her that even in the toughest times, there are always angels disguised as everyday people, making the world a little better one small act of kindness at a time. She took a deep breath, adjusted her grip on the solar system model, and stepped into the cafeteria, completely unaware that this ordinary Wednesday was about to become extraordinary in the most unexpected way. The scene before her was exactly what you'd expect from an elementary school lunch period: controlled chaos with a side of chocolate milk. But as her eyes scanned the room looking for her son, she noticed something that made her pause. Something that would lead to a discovery that would bring tears to her eyes and warmth to her heart. Standing there in the bustling cafeteria, Mrs. Parker's eyes finally found her son, but not where she expected. He wasn't sitting at the usual tables with the other kids who were laughing and trading snacks. Instead, she spotted him at a small table in the corner of the room, and he wasn't alone. The sight made her pause. Her son was sitting with his teacher, Mrs. Reynolds, a woman in her mid-50s with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair. They were sharing what looked like a homemade lunch, and her son was smiling, really smiling, as his teacher told him something that made him laugh. Mrs. Parker stepped behind a column, still holding the science project. Something told her to wait and watch for a moment. She saw how Mrs. Reynolds pulled out a container of fresh strawberries and placed half of them on her son's napkin. The teacher then unwrapped what appeared to be a homemade sandwich, cutting it in half with plastic cutlery, and shared that too. As she watched, a little girl walking past her table stopped to throw away her trash. "Mrs. Reynolds always has lunch with him," the girl said matter-of-factly, noticing Mrs. Parker's curious expression. "They're like best friends now. She brings extra food every day." Mrs. Parker's heart skipped a beat. Every day. She thought back to the past few weeks. Things had been tough since she lost her job at the medical office. She'd been trying to stretch every dollar, sometimes skipping her own meals to make sure her son had enough. But maybe she hadn't been as successful at hiding their struggles as she thought. The lunch ladies were moving around the cafeteria now, wiping tables and checking the time. Mrs. Parker watched as one of them stopped by her son's table. "You enjoyed your lunch today, sweetie?" the lunch lady asked, her voice warm and caring. Her son nodded enthusiastically, and Mrs. Parker noticed how the lunch lady and Mrs. Reynolds exchanged a knowing look. More pieces started falling into place. She remembered how her son had stopped asking for lunch money lately, saying he wasn't hungry or had already eaten. She'd been so caught up in job hunting and trying to make ends meet that she hadn't questioned it too deeply. Now she realized he had been trying to protect her, trying not to add to her worries. The science project felt heavy in her arms as she watched Mrs. Reynolds pull out a small container of cookies, clearly homemade, with chocolate chips still melty. "My grandson helped me bake these last night," she heard the teacher say. "He insisted we make extra for my special lunch buddy." Her son's face lit up as he carefully took a cookie. "These are even better than last week's," he exclaimed, and Mrs. Reynolds laughed, a sound full of genuine joy. They looked so comfortable together, like this was their own little daily ritual. Other teachers passed by, and Mrs. Parker noticed how none of them seemed surprised by this scene. One even dropped off an apple on their table with a warm smile, like it was the most natural thing in the world. This wasn't just one teacher being kind. It was a whole community quietly wrapping their arms around her child. The weight of it all hit her suddenly. The kindness, the discretion, the way they protected her son's dignity while making sure he didn't go hungry. Here she was, thinking she had to carry all their burdens alone, while these everyday angels had been quietly supporting them all along. Mrs. Parker blinked back tears as she watched her son carefully wrap his remaining cookie in a napkin. "For later?" Mrs. Reynolds asked softly. He shook his head. "For my mom," he said. "She works so hard, she forgets to eat sometimes." That's when Mrs. Parker knew she couldn't wait any longer. She needed to step forward, to thank this amazing teacher, to let her son know it was okay. But as she took that first step toward their table, she had no idea that this moment would lead to something even bigger, something that would change not just their lives, but their entire school community. That evening, after the science project had been safely delivered and the school day was done, Mrs. Parker sat at their small kitchen table, watching her son do his homework. Her mind kept going back to what she'd witnessed in the cafeteria. She needed to understand more, but she wanted to approach the subject gently. "How was lunch today, sweetie?" she asked, trying to keep her voice casual as she stirred the pot of mac and cheese on the stove, his favorite comfort food. Her son looked up from his math worksheet, pencil pausing mid-equation. Something flickered across his face. Worry, maybe a touch of guilt. "It was good," he said quietly, then quickly looked back down at his homework. "You know," Mrs. Parker said, moving to sit across from him, "I saw something interesting today when I dropped off your project." She reached across the table and gently placed her hand over his. "I saw you having lunch with Mrs. Reynolds." The pencil dropped from his fingers, rolling across the math worksheet. His lower lip trembled slightly, and Mrs. Parker's heart ached at the sight. "Am I in trouble?" he whispered. "Oh, baby, no," she said quickly, squeezing his hand. "Not at all. I just want to understand. How long have you been having lunch with Mrs. Reynolds?" He was quiet for a moment, then the words started tumbling out. "Since that day I saw you crying over the bills," he admitted. "I heard you on the phone talking about the job, and you looked so worried. I didn't want to tell you I was still hungry after breakfast." Mrs. Parker felt tears welling up in her eyes as he continued. "Mrs. Reynolds noticed I didn't have lunch that day. She shared her sandwich with me, but she did it like it was no big deal. She just said she always packs too much and would love some company. After that, she started asking me to be her lunch buddy every day." He smiled a little, remembering. "She tells me stories about when she was a teacher in other schools, and sometimes about her grandkids. And she always brings extra food, saying her grandson helped cook or her neighbor gave her too many cookies. I think," he paused, looking down at their joined hands, "I think she knows we're having a hard time, but she never makes me feel bad about it." The mac and cheese was starting to bubble on the stove, but Mrs. Parker couldn't move. Her son's next words froze her in place. "The other kids think it's cool that I get to eat with her. Some of them even started joining us sometimes. Last week, when Tommy's dad lost his job, Mrs. Reynolds invited him to be a lunch buddy too. She just makes everyone feel special." Mrs. Parker got up to turn off the stove, wiping her eyes with her sleeve. When she turned back, her son was standing there, holding out a slightly crumpled napkin. Inside was the cookie he'd saved from lunch. "Mrs. Reynolds says sharing food is like sharing love," he said softly. "And I wanted to share some with you, Mom." That's when Mrs. Parker truly broke down, pulling her son into a tight hug. All this time, she'd been so focused on what they didn't have, what she couldn't provide, that she'd missed seeing the beautiful community of support that had formed around them. Her son hadn't just been getting meals. He'd been getting lessons in compassion, dignity, and the true meaning of community. As they stood there in their tiny kitchen, holding each other, the smell of mac and cheese filling the air, Mrs. Parker made a decision. Tomorrow, she would go back to the school, but this time, she wouldn't watch from the shadows. It was time to meet the remarkable teacher who had done so much more than just feed her son. She had fed his spirit, his sense of worth, and his understanding of what it means to be truly kind. What she didn't know was that her visit the next day would set in motion a chain of events that would touch not just their lives, but the entire school community in ways she could never have imagined. The next morning arrived with a gentle autumn breeze and golden sunlight streaming through the kitchen windows. Mrs. Parker had barely slept, her mind full of plans and gratitude. She'd packed a special surprise in her bag, her grandmother's famous banana bread, made late last night with the last 3 overripe bananas from their fruit bowl. It wasn't much, but it was made with love and decades of family history. She arrived at the school early, just as the first buses were pulling up. The hallways were quiet except for the distant sound of the janitor's vacuum and early arriving teachers preparing their classrooms. Her heart was beating fast as she approached Mrs. Reynolds' classroom, but she paused when she heard voices inside. "I just don't know what to do anymore," a woman was saying, her voice thick with emotion. "Since my husband's accident, everything's been so hard. The kids try to pretend they're okay, but—" "You're not alone," Mrs. Reynolds' gentle voice replied. "We take care of each other here. Your children will have lunch with me today, and as long as they need to." Mrs. Parker stepped back quietly, not wanting to interrupt. Through the partially opened door, she could see another parent, one she recognized from school pickup, wiping her eyes while Mrs. Reynolds patted her hand. On the teacher's desk was a large cooler that looked full, and several cloth lunch bags sat nearby. "But I can't pay you back," the woman protested weakly. "Who said anything about paying back?" Mrs. Reynolds smiled warmly. "When I was a little girl, my 4th grade teacher did the same for me. She never asked for anything in return except that I promised to help others when I could. I've been keeping that promise for 40 years now." Mrs. Parker felt her own eyes welling up. She wasn't the only one. Mrs. Reynolds wasn't just helping her son. She was a quiet guardian angel for many families struggling to make ends meet. As she waited in the hallway, more pieces of the puzzle came together. She remembered the lunch ladies always having extra milk cartons they needed to give away. The school librarian who always seemed to find forgotten snacks in her desk when kids stayed late for reading club. The gym teacher who mysteriously had spare granola bars during afternoon classes. The other parent left, looking relieved and a little lighter. Mrs. Parker took a deep breath and knocked on the door frame. Mrs. Reynolds looked up, and their eyes met. No words were needed. They both understood. "I was hoping you'd come," Mrs. Reynolds said softly, gesturing to a chair. "Would you like some coffee? I always brew extra in the morning." Mrs. Parker sat down, placing her banana bread on the desk. "I couldn't sleep last night," she admitted, "thinking about everything you've done for my son, for all these children." Mrs. Reynolds poured 2 cups of coffee from a thermos, the warm aroma filling the room. "You know," she said, "teaching isn't just about books and tests. It's about nurturing souls. When I see a child hungry, for food, for attention, for love, I can't just ignore it. None of us can. But the food, the time, your own money." Mrs. Parker started. "Oh, don't worry about that." Mrs. Reynolds chuckled. "I have my ways. The local grocery store knows me well. They save all the day-old bread and nearly expired produce for our school. The church down the street has a garden program. And you'd be amazed how many grandparents love to bake extra cookies for our lunch buddies." She paused, looking at a wall of student artwork. "You know what the beautiful thing is? The children who join our lunch group, they don't see it as charity. They see it as belonging. They share stories, help each other with homework, look out for each other on the playground. They're learning something more valuable than any textbook could teach." What happened next would surprise them both, as a simple conversation about shared lunches was about to transform into something much bigger, something that would ripple through their entire community. As Mrs. Parker and Mrs. Reynolds continued talking that morning, a knock on the classroom door interrupted their conversation. It was the school principal, holding his morning coffee. His eyes fell on the banana bread on the desk, and he smiled. "I thought I smelled something amazing down the hallway," he said, stepping into the room. "Mrs. Reynolds, I've been meaning to talk to you about your lunch program." His tone was gentle but serious. Mrs. Parker felt her heart sink. Was the school going to stop these lunch meetings? Would her son lose this special connection he'd found? But before she could worry further, the principal continued. "The school board got wind of what you've been doing," he said, pulling up a chair to join them. "And they want to help make it official. They've approved funding for a proper food pantry here at school. We can convert that unused storage room near the cafeteria." Mrs. Reynolds' eyes widened. "Really? But I never asked for." "You didn't have to," the principal interrupted kindly. "One of our board members was actually a student of yours 20 years ago. She remembered how you used to share your lunch with her when her family was struggling. When she heard you were still doing the same thing today, she made it her mission to help." Mrs. Parker watched as tears formed in Mrs. Reynolds' eyes. "I remember her," the teacher whispered. "Little girl with red ribbons in her hair. Her father had lost his job in the factory closure. Well," the principal continued, "she owns 3 restaurants now. And she's offered to provide hot meals twice a week for any student who needs them. No questions asked, no paperwork required." Mrs. Parker found herself reaching for the tissue box on Mrs. Reynolds' desk. The simple act of sharing lunch with students had somehow grown into something so much bigger. "But that's not all," the principal added, his voice warm with excitement. "Other parents heard about your Lunch Buddies program. The owner of the local grocery store, you know, the one who already helps with the bread and produce, his wife is a nutritionist. They've offered to run free cooking classes for families, teaching them how to make healthy meals on a budget." Mrs. Reynolds sat back in her chair, overwhelmed. "I never meant to start anything big," she said softly. I just couldn't bear to see children hungry. That's exactly why it worked, Mrs. Parker found herself saying. Because it came from the heart, you didn't just feed their bodies, you fed their dignity, their sense of belonging. The principal nodded in agreement. The school board wants to call it the Reynolds Community Table Program. They're hoping other schools in the district will follow our example. Just then, the morning bell rang, and they could hear the happy chaos of children filling the hallways. Mrs. Reynolds quickly wiped her eyes and stood up, straightening her cardigan, ever the professional teacher ready to greet her students. "Oh, before I forget," the principal said, reaching into his jacket pocket. "The local diner owner dropped these off this morning. Said something about hearing you needed lunch supplies." He handed Mrs. Reynolds an envelope. Inside were several gift cards for the diner. A note attached read, "For your lunch buddies. We all need a hot meal sometimes. No questions asked." Mrs. Parker watched as Mrs. Reynolds carefully placed the gift cards in her desk drawer, right next to the extra snacks she kept for hungry students. In that moment, she realized that this wasn't just about food anymore. It was about a community coming together, recognizing that we all need help sometimes, and that the simple act of sharing a meal could change lives. As the first students began bouncing into the classroom, their excited voices filling the air, Mrs. Parker noticed something remarkable. Every child who entered, whether they were part of the Lunch Buddies program or not, stopped to give Mrs. Reynolds a hug or share a quick story. This teacher had created more than a feeding program. She created a family. Little did they know, this was just the beginning. The Reynolds Community Table Program was about to change not just their school, but the entire community in ways none of them could have imagined. Word about the Reynolds Community Table Program spread quickly through the neighborhood. By the following week, something beautiful started happening at Roosevelt Elementary. The unused storage room near the cafeteria had been transformed. Parents, teachers, and local business owners had spent the weekend painting the walls a cheerful yellow and setting up shelves and a small refrigerator. "Look what came in today," Mrs. Reynolds called out excitedly one morning, as Mrs. Parker helped stock the shelves. Local farmers had dropped off boxes of fresh apples and pears. The bakery down the street had sent over day-old bread and muffins, still perfectly good. A local dentist's office had even donated new lunchboxes in different colors. But the most touching donations came from other parents. One mom, who worked at a fabric store, made bright, cheerful cloth napkins. "So every child can have something special at lunchtime," she explained. Another parent who worked nights as a chef would drop off homemade soup in the mornings. "I'm up cooking anyway," he'd say with a shrug and a smile. Mrs. Parker's son had noticed the changes too. "Mom," he said one evening while doing homework, "you know how Mrs. Reynolds always shared her lunch with me? Well, today I shared my lunch with a new kid. His family just moved here, and he looked kind of lonely." She paused from washing dishes, her heart swelling with pride. "That was very kind of you, baby." "I didn't tell him about the food pantry right away," her son continued thoughtfully. "I just said, 'Hey, my mom makes the best peanut butter sandwiches, want to try half?' Just like Mrs. Reynolds did with me. Then later, I showed him where he could get more food if he needed it." That's when Mrs. Parker realized the true magic of what Mrs. Reynolds had created. The children weren't just receiving help. They were learning how to help others with kindness and dignity. The program kept growing in unexpected ways. A retired couple who lived near the school started a small vegetable garden in the courtyard. "The kids can help grow their own food," they explained. "There's nothing like eating a tomato you planted yourself." One rainy Tuesday, Mrs. Parker arrived at school to help sort donations and found Mrs. Reynolds sitting at her desk, reading a letter with tears in her eyes. "What's wrong?" Mrs. Parker asked, worried. "Nothing's wrong," Mrs. Reynolds smiled, wiping her eyes. "It's a letter from the high school. Remember that sweet boy who used to be in my class years ago? The one who always stayed for lunch because things were tough at home. He's graduating this year, top of his class. He's been accepted to college on a full scholarship. She handed over the letter, her hands shaking slightly. He wrote to tell me that he's going to study education. Says he wants to become a teacher, just like me. And look at the last part. Mrs. Parker read the final paragraph. Mrs. Reynolds, you probably don't even remember sharing your lunch with me all those years ago. But I'll never forget how you made me feel, not like someone who needed help, but like someone who belonged. Someone worth sharing a meal with. I promise that when I become a teacher, I'll have an extra sandwich in my lunch bag too. Because sometimes a simple sandwich can change a life. As they sat there, both wiping away tears, the morning bustle of school life continued around them. Children's voices echoed in the hallways, mixing with the sound of opening lockers and squeaking sneakers on linoleum floors. Through the classroom window, they could see the first sprouts emerging in the courtyard garden. Mrs. Parker looked at her watch, almost lunchtime. Soon the cafeteria would be full of children sharing meals, stories, and friendship. Some would be eating from lunchboxes brought from home, others from the community table program. But thanks to Mrs. Reynolds, they would all be eating with dignity, with friendship, and with the knowledge that they belonged. And this was just the beginning. As spring approached, the Reynolds Community Table program was about to bloom in ways that would touch even more lives and inspire changes far beyond their little school. Spring arrived at Roosevelt Elementary with an unexpected surprise. One morning, as Mrs. Parker helped organize the food pantry, a local news crew pulled into the school parking lot. Someone had shared the story of the Reynolds Community Table program on social media, and it had caught the attention of a popular morning show. "Oh dear," Mrs. Reynolds fretted, smoothing her cardigan. "I'm not sure about all this attention. We're just doing what neighbors should do." But the principal gently encouraged her. "Think about other schools that might be inspired by our program," he said. "Think about all the children we could help." The news reporter, a warm-hearted woman with kind eyes, didn't focus on the sadness or struggle. Instead, she captured the joy. Children tending the courtyard garden, parents teaching cooking classes, and the bustling community table where everyone felt welcome. "What makes this program special," the reporter observed, watching kids share lunch together, "is that you can't tell who needs help and who doesn't. Everyone just sits together, sharing food and friendship." During the interview, unexpected visitors kept arriving. The local pizza shop owner showed up with fresh garlic knots. "For the cooking class," he said with a wink. A grandmother came in with a cart full of homegrown vegetables. The fire department dropped off boxes of healthy snacks. "You see," Mrs. Reynolds told the reporter, her eyes twinkling. "This isn't my program anymore. It belongs to everyone." The most touching moment came when a small boy, barely tall enough to reach the microphone, told the reporter, "My favorite part isn't even the food. It's eating lunch with Mrs. Reynolds. She always listens to my stories, even the silly ones." That afternoon, after the news crew left, Mrs. Parker found her son in the courtyard garden, carefully watering the tomato plants. "Mom," he said excitedly, "guess what? We're going to have a garden club after school, and anyone who helps grow the vegetables gets to take some home." "That's wonderful, baby," she smiled, noticing how confident he'd become. Gone was the shy boy who had hidden his empty lunchbox. In his place was a caring young person who helped newer students feel welcome. Later that day, Mrs. Reynolds shared some exciting news. Other schools had been calling all afternoon, asking how they could start similar programs. The local college wanted to send student volunteers. A nearby restaurant chain offered to provide weekly hot meals to any school that started a community table. "But you know what makes me happiest?" Mrs. Reynolds said, showing Mrs. Parker a stack of handwritten notes on her desk. "These are from former students. They remember our lunches together from years ago. Now they want to give back." One note especially caught Mrs. Parker's eye. It was written in crayon on construction paper. "Dear Mrs. Reynolds, when I grow up, I want to be just like you. Not because you share your food, but because you share your heart." The afternoon sun streamed through the classroom windows, casting a warm glow over the children's artwork on the walls. In the distance, they could hear laughter from the playground mixing with the sounds of workers building new shelves for the expanding food pantry. Mrs. Parker thought about how far they'd come from that first day she'd spotted her son sharing lunch with his teacher. What had started as one woman's simple act of kindness had grown into something that was changing their entire community. "You know," Mrs. Reynolds said softly, "someone asked me today why I didn't start this program sooner. I told them it wasn't my program to start. It was always here, in the hearts of our community. It just needed someone to open the lunchbox first." As they sat there, the afternoon bell rang, signaling the end of another school day. But for the Reynolds Community Table program, it was just the beginning of a new chapter. Because tomorrow would bring more chances to share, more opportunities to help, and more proof that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest acts of kindness. Summer was approaching, and with it came a new worry. Mrs. Parker overheard some parents discussing their concerns in the food pantry one morning. What happens to the children who depend on school meals during the summer break? One mother asked quietly. Mrs. Reynolds, who seemed to have a sixth sense for these matters, was already one step ahead. That afternoon, she called a community meeting in the school gymnasium. The turnout was overwhelming. Parents, teachers, local business owners, and even city council members filled the bleachers. Summer shouldn't mean hunger. Mrs. Reynolds began simply, standing at the podium. And it won't, not in our community. What happened next showed just how much their small program had changed the whole neighborhood. Hands shot up across the gymnasium, everyone eager to help. The owner of the local swimming pool offered to host free lunch programs during swim lessons. The library announced they would expand their summer reading program to include healthy snacks. "My restaurant can do cooking classes for kids," one chef volunteered. "They can learn to make simple, healthy meals for when parents are at work." The fire station chief stood up next. "We have that big parking lot. Why not do a weekly farmers market? Local growers can sell produce, and families in the program can get special tokens to shop." Mrs. Parker watched in amazement as more and more people joined in. The community center offered their kitchen for meal prep. The movie theater suggested free movie mornings with breakfast included. Even the high school students wanted to help, offering to deliver meals to families without transportation. That evening, as Mrs. Parker and her son walked home, he tugged on her sleeve. "Mom, I had an idea too. What if we did a cookbook? All the recipes from our cooking classes and the stories about our community table. We could sell it and use the money to help more families." She stopped walking and hugged him tight, remembering the shy boy who once hid his empty lunchbox. Now here he was, thinking of ways to help others. The next day, Mrs. Reynolds loved the cookbook idea so much that she brought it up during class. The children immediately started sharing their favorite recipes and stories. One little girl wrote about her grandmother's secret spaghetti sauce. Another shared how learning to make sandwiches helped him take care of his little sister when their mom worked late. "But it's not just about the recipes," one student said thoughtfully. "It's about all of us taking care of each other." The local print shop offered to publish the cookbook for free. Children drew pictures for it, parents shared family recipes, and even the lunch ladies contributed their famous cookie recipe, the one that had been a school secret for 20 years. As Mrs. Parker helped compile the stories and recipes, she found herself getting emotional over the simple, heartfelt entries. "Monday is my favorite," one child had written, "because that's when we make extra sandwiches for the community table. It feels good to help somebody else, just like Mrs. Reynolds helped me." The school year was winding down, but the community spirit was stronger than ever. The summer program was coming together beautifully. They called it Sunshine Meals, because, as Mrs. Reynolds said, nobody should feel in the dark when they need help. One afternoon, while helping to pack up the day's leftover food, Mrs. Parker found her son in the courtyard garden with a group of younger students. He was showing them how to tell when the tomatoes were ripe, just as Mrs. Reynolds had taught him months ago. "Sometimes you have to be patient," he explained kindly, "but it's worth the wait." Just like how our community table grew into something so big and beautiful. Looking at these children tending their garden, planning their cookbook, and taking care of each other, Mrs. Parker realized that they had grown something far more precious than vegetables. They had grown hope, kindness, and a sense of community that would feed their neighborhood for years to come. But even as summer approached, none of them could have predicted the amazing surprise that was just around the corner, about to take their program to places they never imagined possible. On the last day of school, something extraordinary happened at Roosevelt Elementary. The morning started normally enough. Children turning in their final assignments, cleaning out their desks, and saying goodbye to their teachers. But when Mrs. Reynolds walked into her classroom, she stopped in her tracks. Her desk was completely covered in envelopes, hundreds of them, in all shapes and sizes. Some were decorated with children's drawings, others typed formally on business letterhead. They had arrived from all over the country. "What is all this?" she asked, her voice trembling as Mrs. Parker and the principal helped her open them. The first letter was from a school in a small town 2 states away. "We saw your story on the news," it read. "Today, we started our own community table program. Thank you for showing us how to help our students with love and dignity." Another envelope contained a check from a large grocery store chain. "We want to help start community table programs in 100 schools next year," the letter stated. "Your program showed us what's possible when communities come together." But the most touching letters came from ordinary people sharing their own stories. A teacher in a rural school wrote about starting a breakfast club inspired by Mrs. Reynolds. A retired couple shared how they'd begun a weekend backpack program in their grandchildren's school. A college student wrote about remembering his own elementary school teacher who had quietly shared lunch with him years ago. "You started a movement," the principal said softly, watching Mrs. Reynolds read letter after letter. Just then, a small group of students burst into the classroom, excitedly waving a newspaper. Their community cookbook had made the local news, and orders were pouring in from everywhere. The first printing had sold out in 3 days. "But that's not even the best part," one student exclaimed. "Remember that cooking video we made for the school website? A famous chef saw it and wants to do a whole series about kids teaching other kids to cook." Mrs. Parker watched as her son proudly showed Mrs. Reynolds the garden diary he'd kept all year. "We're going to have so many vegetables this summer," he explained. "And next year, we can teach the new students how to grow their own food too." As the last day of school wound down, families began gathering in the courtyard for the summer program kickoff celebration. The garden was in full bloom, picnic tables were laden with food, and children played while parents chatted and shared recipes. Mrs. Reynolds stood quietly at the edge of the courtyard, taking it all in. Mrs. Parker joined her, remembering that first day she'd spotted her son sharing lunch with his teacher. "Did you ever imagine it would grow this big?" Mrs. Parker asked. Mrs. Reynolds smiled, watching as children from all backgrounds sat together, sharing food and friendship. "You know what I see when I look out there?" she said softly. "I see hope. Not just for today's lunch or tomorrow's dinner, but for the future. These children are learning that taking care of each other is as natural as breathing." Just then, her son ran up with a group of friends. They were carrying the first officially printed copy of their cookbook, hot off the press. On the dedication page, in children's handwriting, it read, "To Mrs. Reynolds, who taught us that the best recipes always include a cup of kindness and a gallon of love." As the summer sun began to set on that last day of school, the courtyard was filled with laughter, music, and the sounds of community. The garden vegetables were growing strong, the summer program was ready to launch, and best of all, no child would go hungry, not on their watch. Mrs. Reynolds looked at all the letters on her desk one more time before heading home. "You know," she said, picking up her well-worn lunch bag. "I think I'll need a bigger lunchbox next year. We're going to have a lot more lunch buddies." And so, what began with one teacher sharing her lunch became a movement of kindness that spread far beyond the walls of Roosevelt Elementary. Because sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can create the biggest changes, and a simple shared lunch can feed not just a child's hunger, but a community's heart. The end.